today? Okay. Hi, everybody. So today, well, this is the playable prototype demonstration week. So we've had one team already show some of their playable prototypes, and another 4 teams will be showing tomorrow, which means that it's also the time for me to help get you prepped for what's happening next week and the week after. Because between this week and the next set of presentations, we've got about 3 weeks. And so the question is, now that you've made a game, what is it that you're supposed to do, right? What are you supposed to spend those weeks doing? And as you can probably tell from the slide here, the main focus of this is playtesting. And funny story, when we first started this course, we were mostly focused on just getting through each of the major deliverables. And every semester we would have some sort of surprise requirement. One time we introduced an art style that every game had to adhere to. One time we introduced, like, before we had this collaboration with OCAD, we introduced artists as a surprise requirement. And the surprise requirements that ended up doing well were things that we adopted permanently. So the collaborations between different groups, the music and tech and art is one of the things we adopted. And one of the surprise requirements we did once was playtesting, that you had to get your game in front of a bunch of strangers and you had to test it on about 10 people in order to figure out what they said. But then when we told people about this, people in industry were saying, well, this shouldn't be just a surprise requirement. This should be a requirement, because this is kind of how things work. You never make a game in a vacuum. You have to put this game in front of people, because ultimately that's what this is for. You're making games for people. So one of the necessary steps is to get it in front of people to make sure that the game is going in the way that you plan. So that brings us to what we're talking about today. Now that you have this playable prototype, what's going to happen next? Well, you're going to be spending the next 2.5 weeks doing various things. One is that there's going to be a bunch of features that you want to add, because you got some feedback from this week's demos, and because you know that you weren't able to get everything in by this week. So all those features that didn't get added are going to be now on this list of things you need to add to your game. And then the idea is that there's also going to be other features that you've already added. So the ones that have already been put into your game, some of them need to be fixed. For the earlier set, for the features that you need to add, this one is just going to be a matter of prioritizing, right? You could spend several semesters adding more features to your games. So what you need to do is you need to come up with a good schema that allows you to maximize the features that you add, so that each one is a combination of being really important and really easy, right? This is just a general mechanism for when you've got a set of features and not all of them can fit. You basically make a list and you just keep adding the features to your game until you run out of time, and whatever you get to, that's your game. So the major thing is just to order these items so that the top items are hopefully a combination of things that are easy to do and important, and where one of them is a little bit less, hopefully the other one can make up for it. But for the latter group, this is what we're talking about today. All the things that you've already put into your game that need to be fixed, right? Or not necessarily fixed, but made better, let's say. So this is why we playtest, right? Because you've made this thing, you've put together a lot of hours into generating a playable prototype, making sure the functionality was there so you had something to show. And then during your demo, you got some feedback from our guests on what they think could go into it, or what things seem to be working, what things don't. And this has been kind of the process up to this point, doing these presentations and getting feedback. But the bigger thing now is to say, we need a lot more. Now that people are playing it, we can't just rely on the 3 voices that you hear during your demo, because those could be like outliers. They could have very particular skewed viewpoints. The only way you can really be sure that your game is working the way it's intended is by getting in front of a lot of people and then looking to see what the general trends are, or what general comments you're getting, right? So putting your game in front of people. And most people, when they think about this, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, I've been doing playtesting up to this point, right? It's not that hard. True. It's not hard to get your game in front of people, but there's a certain science to it. And the idea is that while many teams in the past have put their game in front of people and got them to play it, and technically did playtesting in that way. They need to be able to go at this in a more methodical, purposeful way in order to be able to get meaningful results. So this involves not just putting in front of a bunch of people, saying that they played it, and then checking that box. It's about asking yourself, if you're required to put this in front of others and get them to play it, what can you use this opportunity for to get useful results? So you have to find out, what is it that you want to get out of this? You have to find out, what kind of information do you want to find out from your players? Like if you could ask them all something, what would it be? You have to understand how to run this kind of thing so that you can actually get results that are interpretable, and useful. And then, once you do get these results, how are you meant to respond to it? All right. So this is what this next stage is. For the next 2 weeks, you are going to be constantly iterating. So playtesting to gather data and results, looking at that, and then figuring out what needs to be changed. And then after you change it, doing another playtest session, and then look at what kind of results you get from that, and figure out how to change your game. And then doing another playtest session, seeing what kind of results you get from that, and using that to inform the changes to your game. This process is going to be like this sort of a constant iteration process over the next 2 weeks. And to facilitate this is why we actually set up a couple of playtest sessions for you. If only so that it helps to lower the barrier to getting this kind of playtest session running. We've been doing this for a while, so we know that if we can at least hand you the first couple, then you can at least go to these things, and just all you need to do is show up and start going at this thing with a certain plan, and you can get some useful results. So we put together 2. The first one is taking place on Monday. We sent an email about this just to kind of give you a heads up. This is going to take place through the generosity of the UFT Game Design Development Club. I don't know if Val is here right now. Are you here? Nope, I'm not here. We have Val, Ursula, and Murray, who are the heads of the Game Design Club, to thank for this one. Basically, one of their bi-weekly meetings is going to be spent with us playtesting our games. So they've set up their Discord server to have channels for each of our teams. And so what you do is you show up, you use the voice channel and the chat channel the same way you would have in class, except that instead of everybody here getting a turn during a set period, all of you will be simultaneously in parallel making your games available. And club members will come by and hand them a link, and you'll say, here's the game. Here's a link to a form that we want you to fill out to tell us what you think. And then you just spend the time observing them to see what kind of things they do, how are they playing your game, is the way that they're playing your game consistent with how you expected players to be, right? Anyway, so that's the first playtest session. Basically, it's like 2 hours of their bi-weekly meeting is going to be spent with a bunch of club members coming by one at a time to play your game, and you gather data from them to figure out things like where are the bugs in my game, and is my game playing the way I expect. The second playtest session, once you've gathered that data and you've managed to make some changes, gotten rid of all your bugs, maybe fixed up a couple of things that weren't playing quite right, the next session takes place on Friday. That one is going to be taking place from 10 until 4, but you're not expected to be there for the whole thing. We're just waiting for confirmation from Ubisoft that this 10 to 4 window is as planned for them, that still works. What'll happen is that they are going to create a team of like a tech head, an art head, and a gameplay head who will play your games for half an hour each. So once we get the confirmation that this window is okay with them, we'll set up a sign-up page for all of your teams so that you can provide us with all the times that your team would be mostly available, and then we'll construct a schedule out of your availability so that at some point during the day you'll have half an hour where these art these art, tech, gameplay heads will give you like intense feedback on your game. So the hope is that after you've completed playtest with the first group, that you'll be ready to handle some more intense pressure from the second. So those all take place next week. And then the idea is the week after, you would put together your own playtest to basically take the results of these two, change your game in such a way that you think it's, it attends to all the issues that you've been told about, and then do one more playtest to kind of verify that this is the way it's supposed to be. And this is kind of a mirror of like the various layers of playtesting that happens throughout a game. You have one where like you're just going to come across a whole bunch of little like mistakes and things that you really need to fix, because they get in the way of the gameplay, right? You'll have another one where, assuming this thing plays relatively well, you're going to check to see if the experience you're trying to create is, being conveyed in the game you make. And then once you've been making each of these changes, you should have one version which you feel is relatively finalized, and you put it through one last stage of verification to help confirm that, yes, it's the game that you are making is now ready to ship, more or less. All right. And that's what you're in that final presentation, that final version is what you're going to be showing during the presentations 2 weeks from now. Okay. Oh, sorry, not 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now. Okay, and what is the overall outcome should be? Well, for you, it's going to be a bunch of things. In the beginning, you'll be identifying and removing bugs that are interfering with the player's ability to interact with your game. As the next stage will be that you'll be tuning your gameplay more to help make it the experience that you originally intended, and taking away things that shouldn't be there. Like as you're playing, you shouldn't necessarily fix everything. Sometimes the best way to fix things is to remove it. If something is just not coming through or is just interfering with the gameplay, sometimes just cutting it out is the best approach to making your overall game work, right? Cut off the limb to save the patient. And if there is something important that you think should be enhanced or should be added, you can use these sessions in order to figure out what those can be and help make those new elements really shine in your final version. For us, though, we want to see some evidence that you've actually done this, right? We want to see that you've gathered some data, you've put it together in like some sort of tables to help you recognize or look at some of the trends in it, and that you use this in order to inform the final version of your game, right? So we want to be able to say that you didn't just do the playtesting because we asked you to, and you just went through the motions, but you saw the intention behind this to get data to be able to fix your game in the ways that it needs to go, not just what you think it should do right now, because you've been using your own motivations and interests and perspectives to come up with the current version. Now you need to get the perspectives of your audience to help figure out what needs to be done next. So at this point, any change you make should be motivated by what your playtesters say instead of what you think, because you've had enough time to put in your what do you think. Now it's time to integrate other people's feedback. Not to say you haven't integrated other people's feedback, right? Because you've been doing that for all the presentations. You know what I mean, right? It's the idea that now the next changes you make should be in the hands of your audience as opposed to the developers. So this involves 3 major steps, right? Again, a lot of people feel like I've been doing playtesting so far by putting it in front of people and seeing what they think. And yes, it's true and it's good. We just like to help you understand a little bit about the process that people use when they're doing playtesting for real in like the real world, and what kind of things, like steps you need to kind of keep in mind. So these are divided into 3 major categories: prepping for what the playtest is going to involve, actually conducting it, and then analyzing the data that you get as a result. Again, toss things into the chat if at any point there's something you want some clarification on. I know some of the things I'm going to be talking about are going to provoke some questions. So yes, this is half me making sure that I kind of cover some of the high level details, but diving into some of these things more deeply is going to be driven mostly by you. All right, so prepping for a playtest. This is an elaborate setup that we don't expect from you, but it made for a really fun playtest when they were doing it. So first thoughts, who are your stakeholders here, right? Who's trying to get this game to be improved? So definitely you want this to be better. Definitely your players, they want this game to be good. So they're going to want to give you feedback on how to improve it. And, then the question is, okay, so why are you playtesting? So you're playtesting partly because, let's say your boss asks you to do it, because you realize you're not the target audience for your game. You need to make sure that something that you think works is actually working. And you're trying to find some bugs at the beginning, or you're nearly done and you're trying to find some bugs at the end. This all motivates the fact that part of your stakeholders in the real world are going to be people like, your boss and your client. While you and your players are definitely the main focus in this course, in the real world, these kinds of things are also required to make sure that the various people who are paying your salary are also going to be satisfied with the kind of work you're doing. All right, so in preparation, one of the biggest things that people don't do is prepare questions in advance. And you might think, oh, yeah, I'm going to prepare questions in advance. Well, yeah, you are, but it's not just about prepping any kind of questions. It's about being very careful and thoughtful about the questions that you make, because questions that you put together quickly at the beginning end up being kind of useless at the end in terms of the data that you get. So what will typically happen is that you'll get players to play your game, and then after they're done, you'll send them a link to a form that they need to fill out. In this form, you can ask for some basic demographic information if you want, but I'd make these things optional in case people don't care to say what their name is or their age or anything like that. In other circumstances, again, if you are making like a AAA game and you have a particular target audience, this stuff could be useful to make sure that your target audience is being heard or being responded to. Here, you can ask, but don't expect anyone to fill it out. The things that you do want people to fill out, though, are the things where you need the data to be able to get some sense of your game. So you can ask about things like, how challenging was this game? How much did you enjoy certain aspects? What were the controls? Like, how did they feel about the controls for various things? How did they feel about the tutorial level? Each of these things are things where you could have it on like what's called a Likert scale. The Likert scale says on a scale from 1 to 7, can you rate the enjoyment of this game, where 1 is low enjoyment and 7 is high, right? These questions are the typical way that if you wanted to try to gain like some numerical results, like some number that helps to evaluate how good your controls are or how straightforward your tutorial was, you would typically phrase it in that way, right? On a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 is very straightforward and 7 was incredibly hard, how would you rate the tutorial level as an introduction to the game? Making sure, of course, that when you're doing these things, you keep them consistent, right? If you're going to be using this as like a rating system to say, how good or bad it is, make sure that good and bad is always on the same sides of the scale, so that if 1 is easy and 7 is hard, 1 is good, or 1 is bad and 7 is good, it's just they're consistent across all these questions so that people don't get confused having to parse the scales each time they read a question. But it's more the straightforwardness as opposed to saying, like give me evaluate this on, give this thing like a number ranking from like 1 to 10 on how good to think it is, right? It's that kind of stuff is hard. It's better to have like a scale where they can just click on a radio button and just burn through the questions a lot more easily. That's if you want to collect quantitative numerical results. There is also this need to collect open-ended results. You should always have at least 1 or 2 of those where people get to express what they think. Too many of them, and it's going to be too long to fill out, and no one's going to get to the end. But 1 or 2 of those can really provide deep insights that don't get captured in like a numerical system. Okay. With that in mind, you also, when I talk about crafting these questions carefully, I mean that some people, when they ask a question, they don't think too hard about what the question is doing or how it's leading the player. So we really strongly say, you have to think about the way you phrase a question to try to make it neutral so that people don't feel like you're encouraging them to answer in a particular way. right? Because otherwise, if you do, like if you ask questions in a way like saying, did you enjoy this game? Chances are, like you're going to get an answer that's like yes or no. And what are you going to do if they tell you yes? It's like, okay, great. So then you're going to have to question yourself, like, are they saying yes because they actually like the game? Are they saying yes because they like me? Do they like, the way it plays? Do they like the aesthetics? I don't understand what yes means. And if I get, 5 out of 10 yeses, well, what does that do, right? So half the people liked it, half the people don't. What am I going to do about that, right? I can't respond to that. There's nothing that I gain from knowing that. And there's a good chance that if you're doing your own playtest session like the third one, you're going to have people who know you and they're going to say things like, yeah, I enjoyed the game, right? But again, there's nothing that you don't get any information from that. It's more just to kind of pat yourself on the back than it is to actually get things and get something actionable that you can use. Instead, it's more useful to think about asking questions about specific things. So you can say, yeah, on a scale from 1 where you dislike to 7 being that you like, how did this particular starburst mechanic make you feel, right? Or you can make an open-ended question to say, if you want to ask about how they enjoyed it, ask them, what did you enjoy the most about it, right? Asking a yes or no question doesn't give you anything, but if you wanted to find out what made them enjoy the game, that's a more useful thing to ask, right? The open-ended questions require a little bit more time for you to process it because you have to go through individual answers and try to piece together, what common themes you see. But again, it allows people the freedom to actually point out what things they liked in case you weren't able to anticipate them in a rating question like the one before. All right. Sometimes, and especially when you get to say like the Ubisoft test, you might actually have 2 different versions of your game that you're not sure which direction to go. We would say that instead of asking your playtesters, oh, what do you think about us doing something like this? That's great, but if you can pull it off, then you can actually show them 2 different versions and have them play it and say, like, which one do you like more? This can be an extremely useful thing, especially if you've got people who are experts in their field giving you feedback on like what one version captures that the other one doesn't. This is all assuming that this is not too hard to pull off. If it's going to be like a huge development push to make 2 versions, then that's not worth it. But if it's just a small tweak and you want to be able to know whether the tweak is worth keeping or not, make 2 versions and have them try both and then figure out which one they prefer and just go in that direction, right? So this is all the prep in advance, right? Before you do any of these things, these are things that you and your group have to sit down and talk about. What are the major things that we want to ask? Like, what are the things that we're not sure about, right? Don't use this to help tell you things you already know about your game, right? Or to reassure yourself that it's good. You're supposed to be trying to identify the things that are good, or for things that are in question, like, is this thing too fast? Is like the running speed too quick? Is the turning speed too slow? Do you feel like the controls are a little bit too janky? These are things that you would ask in your playtest, so that over 3 playtest sessions, you can tune it to just the right level so that your players really enjoy the experience. All right, but all this stuff happens in advance and requires some thought that a lot of teams don't do. A lot of teams, like, they go straight into just put their game in front of people like they did during this week's demos, without having this kind of preparation that can gather good data in the process, right? And putting in front of people is great, but if you put a little bit of like preparation into it and to making sure your questions are good and into really getting at the things your team really needs to know, then you can get the most out of these playtest sessions before you even start. Okay, let's assume that you've done all this great preparation, right? You figured out the ideal set of questions, they're neutral, they scale nicely so that you can gather them up in a Google form and then look at the tables and try to get numerical values for different parts of your game. Great. Then you have to actually conduct it. And for this, I just want to check something quick. Yeah, okay, no. All right, we'll see this picture afterwards then. So when you actually conduct this playtest, you have to treat this thing like a science experiment. So you go into these things not just with the idea that I'm going to put this in front of people and then stand back and watch them and glory in the enjoyment that they're getting out of my creation. I mean, yes, that's going to come, right? You'll get that moment in the spotlight. But for now, this is meant to be as an experiment where you're trying to go into the world, like make some observations, try to interpret them, and then use them in order to inform the actions you're going to take, right? The initial ones aren't going to be as much of an experiment in that you're mostly trying to find bugs and trying to help clear out all the things that are interfering with your gameplay. But later, you want to have a hypothesis in mind. Like you're going to guess that certain things are going to create or evoke a certain reaction in your player. And so you go in there wanting to test this hypothesis to make sure that what you're intending to do is actually coming through, right? So this is why we often say that you should go into every playtest session with some sort of hypothesis on what things you think the player is going to do and what things you think the player is going to feel, and then use this playtest to help measure whether they're actually doing the things that you expect or feeling the things that you want. So we're going to have a bunch of tools to be able to do this. Yeah, the survey is going to be one of them, right? But that's why we say that's the tool that you need to prepare in advance, because you can't prepare that in the playtest session itself. But there are a lot of tools that are going to be used to complement that take place during the playtest. And so things like watching the players. If we're in person, then you can watch things like body language, but even here, when people are playing online, you can often, if they're willing to share their screen, you can see their facial expressions, or you can hear the things that they're saying. Just little things that help indicate to you what's going on, you know, what they are feeling in a non-verbal sort of way, right? Some players will actually log their game, and that they'll record the entire play session so that they can review it afterwards. We'll talk about that more in a moment, but more often what you'll have in this context, especially if you're playing or getting playtesters to play stuff online, is spoken prompts. So this consists of things like having the players think aloud. So as they're playing the game, you try to find out, you know, have them narrate their experience so that they can say, okay, well, it looks like I'm supposed to take this box and I'm supposed to put it over there. At which point you'd be like, oh crap, that's not what you're supposed to do. Okay, all right, good to know, right? You want them to be able to share their inner narrative with you so that you can see what the player is doing as the game progresses and see whether it's consistent with what you expect. And then afterwards, you know, that's when you get things like the surveys that you put together to help ask them what they thought or to reflect back on their play experience. But a lot of people, what they think is that because I put together a survey, then that's all I need to do to make observations. The rest of the stuff is also important. I mean, game logging is going to be a little bit out of reach for what you're doing here. If you can pull it off, then, you know, awesome. But this is something that's a little bit more in the realm of like AAA studios or professional playtesting groups. So we know a bunch of indie studios in Toronto where they do playtesting, and they used to do it by coming to us, and then we would get a bunch of students to playtest their games. But now they're hooked up with things like, you know, like the Xbox Development Network, and they have their own like in-house playtesting groups that go from game to game, trying them out and just kind of providing that playtesting service. But the game logging then is one thing that you would record the gameplay. Often it would not just be what's happening on the screen, but they would also have like a webcam looking at the player so that you could record their facial expressions while they're playing and see kind of what's going on as they hit certain roadblocks. This is related to some of the research I'm working on right now with trying to measure math anxiety by recording people's facial expressions and trying to sense what parts of the game are causing anxiety in the player's general body language. Anyway, we'll talk about that later. But game logging would often be used in order to try to say, like, where do people die the most? What route do people usually take in order to get to the goal? And with enough of this, and again, this requires a lot of playtesting, which is partly why it's out of reach for us. You can start putting together really interesting graphics like this. This is one of the Team Fortress 2 heat maps. The heat map in this case indicates where people tend to die the most, where red indicates like high number of deaths and blue indicates low number. And so what they found was that they created this set of passageways where, people are supposed to be able to duck behind corners, hide out. But what they found was that this just made a little kill box here, where everybody who stepped into this area just got picked off by somebody else who was camping out ahead of time. So they realized that this design had certain flaws to it, that it was creating kind of an unbalanced experience in that one area. So they could go back and change the level design to help make it a little bit more even. It's going to be, looking at questions, is going to be one player playing at a time? Will have multiple in parallel? I would say that it's helpful if you can get more than one person, play testing a game at a time, then that would be good, because otherwise you'd have like one person playing and the other person just kind of sitting. It's a little bit tricky to be able to observe more than one through Discord. But you could say, all right, we're going to observe one and, have the other person just kind of narrating what they're thinking as they play. But yeah, if you can have like more than one group member there to help monitor like the different people playing the game, then each of you can kind of be responsible for a particular player and, recording the results from them and then just combining them together into one. Yeah, so anyway, this game logging thing, again, if you go and have a tour of like Ubisoft Toronto's studio, they have like a full playtesting studio with all of it. Like they've got the stations where a developer will be side by side with someone who's playing to be able to kind of watch them as they're doing their thing. They also have like a simulated living room with like a one-way mirror on the side that they can use to observe people in a natural environment as they're interacting with the game. Right. So they go to far lengths in order to try to create this authentic playtesting experience. Anyway, okay, that's just a little aside on game logging. Back to the regular thing of what you need to do. One other thing about playtesting that people don't realize is that when you're doing this, you are meant to keep your mouth shut. Even if you see your player going and doing some like foolhardy thing, you have to resist the urge to interfere. Like you have to just kind of watch them do it and just know like, okay, this is a lesson for me, watching what they do. And like the more they do, even if they're like spinning their wheels in some awful direction, you can just say like, okay, now I see why they're doing it. And I will keep this in mind for what I need to change later. You can say things if they need a little bit of coaching. I mean, you have to wait, right? The urge to coach them early is going to be strong. It's like, no, don't go there. Now try pressing this. Okay, now jump onto this. It's like, no. You got to let them try to figure that stuff out. If it's not obvious, you need that lesson by watching them struggle. But when they get to the point where it looks like they're getting so frustrated they don't want to play, that's when you can start giving them little bits of coaching to help them overcome whatever obstacle you're going to fix later. And you also are allowed to talk to them to say, can you make sure to think aloud while you're playing? Just tell me what you're thinking as you play so that I understand kind of what your mental process is as you play the game. Like that stuff is allowed, right? Just to kind of remind people, if they're not providing you with data, just to kind of talk a little bit more. And sometimes you can also ask them about what they're doing if they haven't really voiced it. Maybe they're getting stuck and a little frustrated. You can say like, so what are you thinking right now? Because sometimes when they're stuck, they may not be stuck for the reasons that you imagine. And so it's good to just confirm that sort of thing by just like a tiny little phrase to help remind them to voice what they're thinking. But for the most part, you let them do what they need to do. You let them just go at it, assuming like, pretend like they're going to play your game without you there. What would they end up doing, right? And so you have to allow them that freedom to be able to see where they're going to go if left to their own devices. The other big thing is while you're doing this, you have to be recording things constantly. So it means that yes, you're going to have a survey at the end, but do not take that for granted. Constantly be making notes. Like you can do it on paper. You can do this, like in a, I don't know, like in a document on the side. You can have like Otter, transcribing your voice to be able to take, verbal notes, whatever. As long as you have some system that says, like, here's where, making sure that you're taking notes to say, like, where are the bugs happening? Like, okay, it's at this point, they're following through the geometry. At this point, they, like the kill box is actually too big, or yeah, the hitbox is too big and it's clipping the player when they're not technically, intersecting with this object. In this other part here, they're not able to jump over this thing that they're supposed to, or they think that this is jumpable when it's not, right? Just little things that you need to know, like where do these things happen so they can go and fix them later. Having to say like what parts aren't necessarily bugs, but they're just having too much difficulty with, so you can try to make things easier, try to make things a little harder. Again, we'll talk about that stuff a little bit later too. It's not always that you make things easier when people have difficulty, right? Sometimes it's about just communicating things better or providing a better incentive for people to try to overcome a challenging part. Anyway, finding out things like how did they explore your level? Did they go through it the way you expected? If they didn't, then do you need to change your level, or do you need to embrace their natural tendencies to give them more rewards for going in this direction? The things that you wanted them to do, if you gave them power-ups and you thought they were going to use them, if you had more than one attack, did they use both of them equally, right? Just constantly making those observations so that you can bring it back to any teammate who wasn't there and have them understand what you saw. And often at the end, it's fine if, even if they're filling in this questionnaire, if you have certain questions that you'd like to ask to be able to augment what you've seen during the playtest, that's cool too, right? It's not like, oh shoot, I didn't put a question to my questionnaire, therefore I can't ask it. The questionnaire is supposed to be there, but every playtest will be a little different. And some people will do things that you'll want to follow up on. It's totally cool to do that, get observations that way too. Okay. So that's the before, what you do prepping beforehand, what you have to keep in mind during. And then there's the idea of what happens after. So if you designed your questions well, then what you've collected should be useful and easy to interpret. So one of the questions that I mentioned before is if you ask the thing like, did you enjoy the game? That's the worst because it's a true or false question and doesn't give you anything if they say true or false. A question that has sort of a ranking, like how much did you enjoy the game, is slightly better. But even then, if you ask how much did you enjoy the game from a scale from 1 to 7, what does it mean if they tell you 5? Or what does it mean if the average is 5? What does it mean if the average is 5, but the distribution is wide, right? Like, yeah, you get a better sense that some people overall rated this game well versus badly, but this isn't Metacritic. This is about trying to use this information to help give you data to act on, right? So the questions that you ask have to be actionable, right? You have to be able to know if I get a high or low rating on this, that this is going to indicate something I need to do. But saying that this has high enjoyment doesn't tell you anything except, making you feel good. Better would be to skip those questions because every question you ask that doesn't give you information isn't worth asking, right? If it doesn't help you, then leave it out. As much as you'd want to know whether people enjoy your game or not. What's better is to ask more specific questions about things that you can adjust. So asking if, the speed of the player character is too fast or too slow, that's where a number can help you adjust, right? You can change something in response to their rating being high or being low. So again, think about what kind of questions you're going to ask with the idea of what would a numerical response to this question actually do for me in terms of changing my game? And like I said, you can't ask too many questions. These surveys could be overly long if you put in everything. So make sure you cut out anything like this, which doesn't have any major use for it. One question we always get is, can we change our playtesting survey? The answer to that is, within a single playtesting session, you cannot. Which means that if you're doing like the playtesting session with the Game Design Club, whatever survey you have is your survey. Yeah, you can ask 1 or 2 questions as an interview at the end, but that's basically like you're not going to change your survey questions during this thing unless one of your survey questions is broken, right? But you want to be able to have within a single session a number of data points that are all answering the same question so that you can look at those data values afterwards to try to pull out some kind of information from it, which means that your survey has to be consistent across a single playtest session. So that's the only exception to this is if like your playtest is revealing that there's like a bug that's stopping your player from actually like playing your game. In that case, yes, you can go in and you can change your build and you can adjust that. Your survey should still be the same, but your build can change if you need to fix something during your playtest session. Otherwise, your build and your questionnaire should both be consistent within a single playtest so that you can really sense how this version of the game is doing before we start making changes to it. After you've done one playtest session, you really need to fix things before you go into the next one. If you're showing the same game to Ubisoft as you show to the Game Design Club, then it's a bit of a waste of a playtest because then it's basically one big playtest instead of two separate ones. You do the first one, you figure out what needs to be changed, you change it, you show it to the next group, and then get their viewpoints on the updated, polished game, right? So each one of these playtests, these 3 playtest sessions, should have changes in between them to make sure that the newer game gets feedback and then the next version gets feedback. Because yeah, each one you're trying to find out different information. Interpreting the data. Okay, this is where just, again, having done this a lot of times, like we know some of the pitfalls that can happen when you're trying to interpret your data. So let's just point out a couple of things that you need to know. First off, don't take your playtesters too seriously. You've encountered this already in that within a particular feedback session or between feedback sessions, you can get like wildly different opinions from different guests, right? Because everyone comes from a different place. Some people feel very strongly about, how the aesthetics of a game should be. Some people feel strongly about having like a narrative or like a storyline. Some people feel strongly about, the controls being a certain way. You can't overfit to any single playtester. The reason why you get volume is so that you can look at general trends and try to respond to those. But just because someone said, this thing sucks, doesn't mean you have to necessarily change that thing. You have to take that into account, hear it, and then step back and say, okay, does it actually suck? Do I think it sucks now that someone's pointed it out to me? And then you can sort of use that to say, yeah, I think it does actually suck. Maybe I want to change it. But if you disagree with them, that's fine too, right? You don't have to do everything that your playtesters tell you to. You just have to be able to hear it and absorb it, and then use that to inform whatever changes you do make. Always kill bugs, right? Don't wait until every playtester has seen the same bug. If you see a bug, you can fix it. It's like the larger features, like the intentional things that you put in, that you want to wait until you've had a bunch of results before you try to decide how to adjust it. But bugs, yeah, kill them right away. And the other piece of advice is that you have to organize a third playtesting session. We've set up 2 of them for you, but the last one is on you. So these things don't just come together like the day before. You have to start thinking about recruiting some playtesters and say, like, having them available for when you think your second update will have happened, right? So say like, okay, we're going to aim to have a bunch of playtesting take place 2 Tuesdays from now. All right. So each of us in our group is going to find some people who are, like at least arm's length enough to be able to give us subjective feedback. And we're going to get them to commit to playing our game for like half an hour on Tuesday. And then we're going to use that to figure out, what is our final version going to look like, right? But again, the playtesting sessions that we set up for next week, we've been organizing those for a month and a half. Basically, since the course started, that's when we start talking about these things. So just in case you think we just kind of pull those things out of like thin air, they do not come easily. Neither should your third playtest. So start looking at getting people to commit now to a particular date when you think your second update will have been completed, and just start putting some of the effort into that now. Anyway, okay, so the last thing is, and we're going to spend a little bit of next Thursday talking about this, is the last thing is going to be the playtesting report. All of this is aiming towards both making your game, like basically the main reason for doing all this playtesting is to polish your game so that the next presentation we have, like it is gone through several iterations of feedback and it is now in the version that you feel confident is relatively finalized. But for us, we do need a kind of deliverable to show that you have actually gone through the process and that your final deliverable has been informed by the playtesting you've done. So in the weekend after you do, the next presentation, like right now, this is the alpha presentation. When you do the betas, at the end of that week, we're asking you to submit a report that basically just transcribes the contents of your data. So it shows, here's what we did. We did this playtesting session with the UTGDC, this one with Ubisoft, and this one with, this subgroup of people from a club I'm part of. I don't know. But then after each one, like this is what we got from the questions that we asked. This is what we decided needed to be done. And so this is what changes we made. And then the second play test, this is what we saw, this is what we did. Third play test, this is what we saw, this is what we did. You're not meant to put together any like giant flowery language. It's basically going to be just a narration of what your development process was for the 2 weeks to come, with a few, like just some basic numbers that you collected to help support the decisions you made. That's all it is. But we just need this as like a formalization of what you've done to show that you actually use the playtesting sessions the way they were intended. Right? So we'll talk more about the playtesting report in more detail next week, but this is just a high level idea of what it is that you're going to want to record and just, gather up and send to us by the time we meet up again. So we want to make sure that you gathered and analyzed the data, that you use the results to inform the changes to your game. That's basically it, right? Like just packaging up what you've already gathered on your own nicely, right? That's it. That's basically just what I needed to warn you about so that when you go into next week's playtest sessions, you're at least somewhat prepared and know kind of what things you're going to do to get the most out of them. Just a quick little shout out to Dustin. He was a former TA of the course, who's also an HCI, and his major thing was about playtesting. So his research was about setting up like this couch setup in the DGP lab on the 5th floor, and then recording hours and hours of people just sitting there playing video games and watching TV so that he could observe what gestures they did to make sure that the Kinect could be programmed with some sort of gesture interface that people wouldn't be doing naturally. Anyway, so he was cool. I don't know where he is right now. I think he's somewhere on the West Coast. But thanks to him for helping like with some of the design principles in these slides. All right. So that's it for today. We'll talk a little bit more next week. We'll be talking about ludology again, just to get at what things go into like this final, like the final considerations of fun for your game. And then the week after we'll be talking, or sorry, the Thursday after that, we'll talk more about the playtesting report and what you need to start recording and what we're expecting you to see. All right. That's it for me today, though. Hope you all have a great day.